My name is Michele Thomson. I live in Vancouver in Canada. And so my nursing career has been varied. I have been practicing for, I think, almost 29 years now, and I've worked in a lot of different environments. I've always been drawn to seniors care. So, in some aspect, I've always been caring for seniors. But after I graduated nursing school, I started working in intensive care unit where I graduated in a small town. And then I really kind of moved through my career after that. I do consider myself a loyal employee, but I just had a lot of opportunity available to me. So I transitioned to working as a nurse in an autistic home for young adults. And I was responsible there for behavior modification training as well as reviewing all of the medications that the young adults were on. And then I worked as a palliative nurse in the community in people's homes in my early 20s. And that was really pivotal to my nursing career because I was caring for people my age that were dying of AIDS. And it made me look at the end of our life and palliative and death and dying very differently. Uh, Not long after that, I started working for the government in a position working with medically fragile children and placing them into existing recreation programs that the city that I was living in offered, and also offering hospice and respite to those children to give their family members a little bit of a break. I'm manager in a community environment of nurses that were going into people's homes to provide care. And then in 2006, I decided to get my nursing specialty in gerontology. It's a national certification, and I'm very proud of that. And then I moved across country to where I reside now to take a job working as a administrator in a long-term care home for a very large long-term care company here on the West Coast. And when I left them after several years, I went to go work for a health authority here for First Nations. And that was also very pivotal in my nursing career in terms of how I look at health and wellness and the holistic approach of care. And I am currently working as a VP of operations for a long term care company. It is by all means the dream job I've always waited for. And in 2017, I also opened my own consulting business. So I have kind of one foot in each of those positions. Well, I found that in North America, it's been my experience that we don't often embrace our seniors in the same way that other countries do, where families will live as a multi generational unit. And I was very close to my grandmother growing up. I grew up as an only child to a single mother, and my grandmother was very much a mother figure to me. And I saw that when she unfortunately had to go into care before she was ready, that she didn't always get the care that I wanted for her as a nurse. And the care was sometimes better than others, depending on who was working. And I also saw how my mother, who was her primary caregiver, was often disregarded and her concerns were not addressed. And I really wanted to ensure that I would never be the administrator of a long term care home where families were not felt to be part of the care planning process and decision making of their loved one, and that our standards would be set far above what the expectations were so that residents would be able to live with a gentle, persuasive approach if we did have any sort of behaviors that were present, but that they would also be able to live with respect and dignity that was provided by their caregivers. So, I think the other piece of that is that I'm stubborn. I'm a Leo and I come by it naturally. I say, I received a lot of pushback from my colleagues that seniors care was not really a respected area of nursing practice and that I would lose all my clinical skills. And I really wanted to prove everybody that that wasn't true. And I think that with my experience working as a end of life and palliative nurse, I really look at death in a very different way. It is a very intimate experience when you get to be in a room with someone when they take their last breath. And I wanted to make sure that families had an amazing experience with their loved one if they chose to be present, and that our caregivers were able to help them through that difficult time. Well, again, my experience has been that there was this idea that you weren't good enough if you were working in a long term care environment to have worked in a hospital. There were times when I remember telling people when they asked, like, what do you do? And I tell them I'm a nurse. And then they would say, oh, well, what hospital do you work at? I would say, I actually work in long term care with seniors. And often shortly after, the response I would get was, "Oh, you're not good enough to work in the hospital." And I even had that same response from some of the colleagues that I worked with, and they would somehow apologize that I was working in that environment like it was a really awful thing. And the concept was that we were just going around and giving pills to seniors all day, and then we were not really doing anything in between because what do you do for an elderly person? And, I think that because it isn't specifically often seen as a true medical model when you're working in long term care environments, other healthcare professionals don't often understand the complexities of working with seniors. And, I always try to use the example of pediatric nursing and geriatric nursing. And so, with pediatric nursing, children don't always have the language skills developed to be able to express what is happening for them. They can't often tell you where they have pain or where there's discomfort or if they're not feeling well generally. Well, seniors are often the same way, particularly if there is a cognitive disruption like Alzheimer's or dementia present, they lose those skills to be able to express what's happening for them. So, nurses that work in this specialty area of nursing really require to have very complex and wonderful assessment skills to be able to ascertain what is happening with that resident without them being able to necessarily be the historian to tell us what's happening. I think you also need to have a very strong understanding of the difference between dementias and deliriums and understanding that sometimes things will resolve if we can figure out what is happening and have a strong understanding of pharmacology, psychotropic medications, and how they affect seniors. So I think it's a very complex area of nursing, and we've made improvements over the years for sure in terms of how it's being perceived. And I can see a lot of nurses that are now really wanting to come into a geriatric environment because they see the complexities, but we still have a ways to go. Well, 2 words, toxic and dysfunctional. And, it was a really difficult decision for me to leave, that position despite having just said that to you, because I really thought that that was going to be an organization that I retired in as a nurse. So when I started in 2006, having moved across country to take this position, I had been interviewed by an organization on a few occasions with them. And presumably everything seemed really fine. I was going to become the general manager of a 152 bed long term care home for seniors. And when I arrived, I was really excited. And I did everything that I thought I was supposed to do as a leader. I tried to engage people and give them some autonomy. And I tried to do fun things in the workplace. And that worked for a while. And after about 3 or 4 months, I noticed that there was a shift. It was subtle, but there was a shift that was happening with the staff. And I started to feel a bit of disengagement. And I couldn't really figure out what was going on. And I didn't really have a lot of support. So I just continued on, only to come to work one day. And I learned from our administrative assistant that a licensing inspector was on their way to the home. And that's not really unusual where I live, that they will sometimes come and just do spontaneous visits to make sure you're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. Unfortunately, she informed me that the reason that this licensing officer was coming to our home that day was because a nurse in our home had reported me for covering up the death of a resident. And in that moment, I felt the blood drain from my body. And not because I knew it was true, but because I knew it wasn't true. And I had only been working for this company for a few months. And I thought, what if they think this is true? And I honestly didn't know that I had their support. So I went through 2 days of an investigation. And it clearly proved that this was not the case, that I did not cover up the death of a resident. And when the nurse that made the accusations was asked why she said things, she admitted to elaborating conversations that her and I had had, and some of them were fabricated. But she had said that she thought that if she could get me fired, that things could go back to the way they were, which was basically allowing them to do whatever they wanted. And it was in that moment that I realized that I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea how to lead a dysfunctional team. And I started having panic attacks going to work every day because I knew that I was ill equipped to be able to manage this environment. And I also knew that unfortunately I didn't have the support of senior leaders in that environment. And I don't think that it's that they were intentionally trying to not support me. They just assumed that when they hire someone in that role who is competent to do the day-to-day operations, that they'll just figure the leadership piece out. And that's just not the case. And so while I did have a few mentors that I could talk to, for me, it just became an environment that I had to realize that it wasn't worthy of me sacrificing my mental health. And I decided to move on. I believe that nursing was always my calling. I remember as a young girl, probably 6 or 7 years old. As I said earlier, I grew up as an only child to a single parent, and my mom was a lab technician in one of the two hospitals we had in the small town I grew up. And sometimes my grandmother would come pick me up after school if she was working a shift that went beyond, normal school time. And my grandma sometimes would drop me off at the hospital. And, the rules back then were a little bit different in the 70s and 80s. And I was allowed to sit at a little desk in the back room. And if I completed my homework before my mom's shift ended, she would often take me upstairs to the maternity floor. And all of her friends were nurses. And so they would let me hold the babies. And I just was hooked. I just thought they were amazing. And I wanted to be just like them. So that I think was the first, I don't know, I guess maybe a memory that I have of really wanting to become a nurse and just being hooked every time I was able to go up and see nurses in action. It just solidified for me that that was what I wanted to do. Yeah, well, I think that there's a few things that came to mind. So, I believe that understanding the power of words is important no matter where you work, and particularly in nursing. When we use our words and when we're providing, care to people, it's really important that we are very clear and we are very specific about what we're doing, what we're asking for people, what those outcomes will look like. And I also find when we talk to family members, they're often sometimes experiencing some of the worst things in their life. They may have just been told that their loved one has passed away or is passing away. And that doesn't always bring out the best in people. And I believe that in those moments, we have to really be aware of the words that we're using and how we're holding space for people, that we're able to show compassion and empathy in some cases, to know that we're there to help support people. I also think it's really important to demonstrate skills that show how important it is to be able to connect with other people. So, where you can share an experience that is similar to something someone else is going through so that they understand that you understand. It's not that I'm a nurse and I'm just speaking to you as a nurse. I think that we learn in nursing school about this professional relationship that we have to maintain between our patients, clients, residents, whatever word you use, and that we're always having to be professional. And while I completely agree with that, I also think that there's a piece of that that really good nurses are able to show a piece of themselves without it getting in the way of that professional relationship. And this is something that comes up a lot in long-term care, and I get asked a lot by the people that work for us is it okay if I cry when a resident passes away? And I always tell them it's absolutely fine. In most cases, families find it incredibly comforting to know that someone else is grieving the loss of someone that they love and care for very deeply, and that they think of that person as an extension of their family. Where it becomes a problem is when that family member is maybe comforting you as a nurse or as a care provider. And that's that piece where I think that therapeutic line gets crossed. So, I also think that we've made leadership more complicated than it needs to be. And nurses are really exemplified leaders. And I have a ton of books here in my office at home that tell me that if I acquire certain attributes or skills, that it's going to make me an extraordinary leader and ability to hold space for people in an exceptional way. And I really just believe that we have two jobs. We are there to keep people safe and to also create trust amongst each other and with the people that we're serving. And I believe that nurses need to know that they already have everything that they need to be extraordinary in their practice. So I think the biggest thing for me has been learning to be okay with breaking the status quo. For years, I was made fun of, as I said earlier, that my leadership style was kind of seen as this soft approach and that I would be a pushover. Well, things started to shift when people started to see that I was having some of the best clinical KPI outcomes in the organization that I was working for and some of the best employee and family resident satisfaction surveys. Then people started to lean in and ask some questions. So I always like to tell people, don't be afraid. Do you? So I started my business in 2017 because I was actually exiting a position where I was the general manager of a long-term care home, and a group of physicians who I'd been working with approached me and said, "Well, we wish we would have known you were leaving because we would have hired you." And, I thanked them, but said that would have really been unethical. And I went on to my other position and didn't really think anything of it. And a few months later, I received a phone call from someone who works for that division of family practice. And they had said, "Hey, listen, we got some funding, government funding. We were wondering if we could hire you as a consultant to create and deliver curriculum to several long term care homes in the area where I live." And I had said, "Yes, what kind of curriculum would you like?" And they said, "Well, remember when you were trying to decrease the unnecessary transfers from long term care to the acute care sector?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, you had some of the best outcomes. So can you just create that curriculum and then teach everybody else how to do it?" So my business was born really out of that request. And it was actually my husband who encouraged me to really create that business. I believe that at that time he had more of an entrepreneurial spirit in him than I do now. And now that I am my own business owner, I think that that sort of comes out in you over time. And I thought that what I was doing for them was what I always wanted to do. I love to teach and I love to share information and learn from other people. So having the opportunity to develop curriculum and then deliver it seemed like a dream. And it's amazing that when you're given the things that you think you want, you realize that sometimes they're not exactly what you want them to be. So, this came back to my earlier share with you about the story that I shared from my career where I was accused of covering up the death of a resident. Well, I was starting my business, I realized that consulting wasn't really something that I wanted to do in the context of creating policies and procedures for people or just creating curriculum and then delivering it. I had to ask myself, why do I want to start this business? And what is something that I would want to do long term? And what I really kept coming back to was that story. And that story for me is an indication that I want to move the needle in our healthcare system around leadership and how we develop leaders to be able to manage the complexities of working in a healthcare system. So now that's the work that I'm doing. So now I do leadership development coaching and consultation with organizations and professionals to help them understand that they don't have to choose a bottom line over a human connection. They can have both. There's a better way that they can beat the stress and the burnout and the moral injury and the compassion fatigue that they're experiencing often by allowing themselves to understand the basics of how we're all hardwired to connect and bring that human centric piece into the workplace and have it not be seen as a soft skill. So, from that, I developed a online leadership program, and this was really from years of me going through that process of really trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And so I've saved people the time and the effort, and I've put all of that experience into an 8-week online leadership program. And that really walks through an acronym that I created called Person Centered Leadership Approach. And each of those is a component that I feel is essential to being able to lead in a way that feels just very genuine and authentic to each person, but also allows them to understand how we are hardwired to connect so that they can hold space well for people, and understanding that the way that I see the world is based on my lived experiences. But it's also crucial to be able to know how to see the world from other people's perspectives so that we can create culturally safe and trusting workplaces. It's kind of bringing the humanity back to the workplace. That's a great question. And I think for me, I have a very strong ethical core in me. And so when I'm working at my job, my 9 to 5 job, I'm all in on that job and I love it. I feel so grateful to be working for an organization that has an owner that has complete trust in me and gives me autonomy. He really is just the type of person that says, I don't need to know everything unless there's a problem. I trust you. Just go do. And I've never had that in my nursing career before. So I'm incredibly grateful to be where I am and why it's been so hard for me to let it go. I also love the people that I work with at our homes. I have the opportunity to go and see them about every 6 to 8 weeks. And I really enjoy that time and connecting. So, I think for me, when I'm working in that position, I'm all there and I'm not really thinking about anything else. My business, though, is really important to me. And as I'm aging into that piece where I'm really starting to think about retirement, I'm over 50 now. I want to start to be able to create a foundation where I can continue to do work that I love on my terms and start that foundation. So for me, that means that there's a lot of extra hours that I have to put in. I'm very grateful that I have a very understanding husband. As I said, he's also an entrepreneur, and close family and friends that understand. So sometimes it means early mornings and late evenings and working on weekends to kind of juggle and fit it all in. And am very mindful of making sure that I am not stressing myself out or burning myself out. I had an episode of burnout about a year ago in the midst of COVID, and I feel that I'm still recovering from that. So I'm very careful to be mindful that I need to incorporate pieces of self care into my daily routine. And that includes jogging and meditation and different things that feel really good for me to keep me really aligned and centered. But it's also invigorating and exciting. And it's this new world that I never knew before. And I'm really having fun with it. Well, that's a great question. And the first thing that came to mind was I would like us to look at not using toxic language. I come across words like or phrases like we eat our young. This is one that has been in the nursing profession for longer than I've been nursing, where we have this sense of rite of passage. So we'll watch nurses that are coming into the profession sometimes struggle and not help them because we think that if they can get through that, then somehow that's kind of given them that sense of, okay, you have a right to be here. And it's just such a twisted way of thinking, I believe, in that we're in a caring and helping profession, and yet we're not always so caring and helpful to those that are our colleagues and our equals. I also, have been hearing two buzzwords that are coming up a lot since the pandemic, which is building resiliency and doing self care. And while I have no problem with those words because they are important, I think that they're being misused and they're leaving people to feel that if they are struggling, that they are somehow less than or failing. And the reality of it is that we are not intended to stay in a heightened state of fight or flight for a long period of time. Our bodies are just not equipped to do that. And in some cases, it doesn't matter how much resiliency you've developed or how much self care you do. You are just going to wake up one morning and say, not today. And so I want to help organizations to create systems where employers can understand that allowing their employee to take a day off or go to have a self care half day at the spa isn't going to fix someone that's well into a burnout journey, that they need to have workplace wellness plans that are going to allow people to recover from burnout. That could take 6 months to a year for some people, and that they can do that without judgment so that they want to return to the workplace and continue to give care and be in a position that they love and that they've always wanted to do. I want to stop the mass exodus of people leaving the healthcare system. I think the other piece for me too is that I really want to help organizations understand, as I spoke about a little bit earlier, that hiring leaders isn't based just on the skills that they can do that will carry them through the day to day operations and functions of their job. It's really not about allowing them to just figure out the leadership part. It's really about investing in leadership development for all leaders. When people invest in their people, that they feel committed to that organization because they feel supported. And leaders who receive leadership training will often tell you that they become so much more self-aware, where they understand the power of their words and simple strategies that help them to build trust in a changing environment, in a very complex environment where people will feel safe and they're free from that toxic and dysfunctional behavior that they have maybe been exposed to or are currently being exposed to. When we start treating our employees like our most important asset that we have, then that's when people, I think, will stop leaving the organizations that they're currently working for and start to feel like a priority. It's difficult to do in the healthcare system because we're trained to say that our patients, our customers, our clients, our residents are our first priority. And it doesn't feel right when we say that we're prioritizing our people over those that we care for. And I really think that this is something that I would like to start to hear conversations about, because I just believe that it's good business practice when we're in the profession of caring for people that we're putting our people as our first priority. It's just good business practice. When those people feel valued and cared for, they will absolutely be able to have the ability to provide exceptional care, and they will want to always go above and beyond. So, I heard a quote years ago at a conference that I had attended, and this question really made me think about that, which was, the culture of an organization is shaped by the worst behavior that it's willing to tolerate. I think that was a quote by Gunter and Whitaker, if I'm correct. And I really believe that to be true. And so I often ask organizations that I have the honor to work with, where there's some rub and tension, is let's just sit down and talk about what's the worst behavior we're willing to tolerate and reverse engineer a safe culture from there. Wow, that's a great question. I think that I would just try to remind myself more frequently why I chose to go into the profession and how it's positively impacted and enriched my life. I think that sometimes it can be really easy over time for the profession to kind of take over, and it can be very depleting at times. And we don't always think about all of the good aspects of what we do and how we do it, and the opportunities to meet people that we would have never otherwise met, and sometimes to help them through some of the worst times of their life. And I think that I would have probably, in hindsight, taken more time to really appreciate those opportunities and see it more as a blessing. And I think what I said earlier is the biggest one for me. And as I said, I'm 51 now, and I feel more aligned with myself than I ever have in terms of how I'm continuing to evolve and grow. And I say that, this is sort of like the mom in me, is like, don't be afraid to find your own path. I spent years feeling like I was less than in my profession because I chose to work in an environment that people didn't value and didn't see as kind of this sexy and interesting space. And those feelings often held me back from showing up as the best nurse that I could. And I realize now that had I been able to really embrace my decision and the bravery that I had to go into long term care and to specialize in that area of practice, I probably could have been a better nurse in some cases. And while I don't have any regrets, because I think that's the whole journey of us learning, when you know better, you do better. I would just offer that as wisdom from an older nurse who's been around for a while, is to say, just go out and follow the area that feels most authentic to you and show up as the best version of yourself every day. Give yourself grace, because some days are going to be really, really hard. And it's okay to get in your car and have a cry. And all you have to do is just show up the next day. And it's a new day. Every day is a new beginning. So I'm just, again, I'm incredibly honored to have had this opportunity to meet you as well. And thank you for just giving me a platform to be able to have a voice. This has been, I always have so much fun when I get to do these things. And I'm just very, very, very grateful. So thank you.